Greetings, and welcome back to the 31 Nights of Frights. In the previous episode, we took a look at Ridley Scott's Alien, a film that took the slasher genre into outer space, and as a result, we ended up with one of the greatest and most influential science fiction horror movies of all time. And in today's video, we're going to be taking the jump from the 70s to the 80s, a decade of which I think I can safely say is a favourite of most people, from the music to the video games and of course to the movies. This was the splatter age of horror movies, and in the coming decade we'd see a whole new wave of horror movie icons, and we'd see many franchises be built around them, with the movies getting numerous sequels. With the release and massive success of John Carpenter's Halloween in 1978, a plethora of movies would come along in the next decade that copied the formula and tropes that Halloween established. And the most famous of these movies is none other than Sean S. Cunningham's Friday the 13th from 1980. Just like Halloween, everyone is familiar with this franchise and its killer, the hockey mask wearing, machete wielding horror icon, Jason Voorhees. At least that's who most people expect to show up in this movie, slaughtering his numerous adolescent victims. But that's not exactly how the franchise started out. Written by Victor Miller and directed by Sean S. Cunningham, Friday the 13th follows a group of teenage camp counselors who, while attempting to reopen Camp Crystal Lake, which is said to be cursed, are murdered one by one by a mysterious killer. Originally, the film was titled A Night at Camp Blood. The screenplay was written in early 1979 and was still being finished by the time it came to filming in summer of the same year. The movie was filmed primarily at a real-life summer camp called Nobi Bosco in New Jersey, and it would be the first film that would use the camp setting trope that became a popular setting for future slasher movies to come, such as Sleepaway Camp and The Burning, for example. Another thing to note about this movie is that it would be the first independent movie of its kind to be distributed by a major Hollywood studio. In Friday the 13th's case, that was Paramount Pictures, and Warner Brothers would distribute it internationally. You can tell that by this point in time, these big studios were taking notice of the monumental success that these slasher movies like Halloween were receiving, and clearly they wanted a piece of that pie. The film begins with a flashback sequence to 1958, where two camp counselors sneak off to do the deed. However, there's no happy ending here, as they are both quickly murdered by an unknown attacker before we get some honestly really cool intro titles. Right off the bat, we can already see similarities to Halloween, as the film begins with a murder from the point of view of the killer, and this camera technique is used a number of times throughout the movie. Coming to the present day, a camp counselor called Annie, played by Robbie Morgan, is travelling to the soon-to-be reopened Camp Crystal Lake and asks the locals of a nearby town for directions. One of the locals offers to take her halfway there before a strange man called Crazy Ralph warns Annie that the camp has a death curse. Now, I'm not sure if Friday the 13th was the first movie to do this, but this kind of character that warns others but nobody takes seriously has become a cliche all in itself. After Annie is dropped off, she hitches a second ride with none other than the killer, who ends up slashing her throat. This is very reminiscent of Psycho, as up to this point it seems like Annie is going to be the central character for the movie, but is quickly disposed of, just like how Marion Crane was in Psycho. From this point on, the film takes place at the camp, and its unsuspecting counselors, Ned, Jack, Bill, Marcy and Brenda, are killed off one by one. Friday the 13th was definitely the movie that established the idea that sex equals death. Or if sex isn't an option, I guess there's always strip monopoly, I guess that counts too. This will be a good time to mention that the awesome special effects work in this film is done by none other than the master of gore, Tom Savini, who was hired off the back of his work for George A. Romero's Dawn of the Dead. Whereas Halloween didn't really have any blood or gore at all, Friday the 13th is a completely different story. This film is truly the classic example of slasher film gruesomeness. From throats being slit to axes going into the head, Friday the 13th is a film that's not here to around, and this would become a staple for the rest of the franchise to come. The highlights of the sequels would be all the different creative and gory ways that Jason would dispose of his many victims. The then practically unknown actor Kevin Bacon plays the character of Jack, and he gets by far the most creative and memorable kill in the whole movie, as the killer holds back Jack's head from under the bed and pierces an arrow right through his neck. But as it would turn out, this death scene wasn't the easiest or most comfortable to film. At one point during the shot, the tube squirting out the fake blood became loose from its pump, so Tom Savini's assistant, 𝘎𝘼𝙍𝙍𝙊𝙒, took it upon himself to get hold of the tube and blow into it. Now that's dedication to the craft. A cool little anecdote is that I once bought Tasso a pint of beer. This was at the Weekend of Hell convention in Manchester, and I had a really good chat and a good laugh with Tasso with a group of friends. It was really awesome, and Tasso is a really cool guy. One f***ed up thing about this film is that there's a scene where the councils are scared of a snake, and then one of them kills it with a machete. This wouldn't be so bad if it wasn't for the fact that it was a real snake. I know that this story has gone viral on the internet a few times in the past, but it is really horrible, and obviously it's the worst aspect of the movie. From that point on, you are really rooting for that killer. I should also talk about the awesome score for this film, written by the masterful composer Harry Manfredini. This is still one of horror's greatest themes in my opinion, and Manfredini would go on to write the music for most of the sequels. The disco theme from part 3 is definitely my personal favourite though. When I met Harry Manfredini, who's the nicest guy by the way, we had a really cool and nerdy chat about music. Most of you probably don't know this, but I play the piano, so me and him had a long talk about all kinds of musical nonsense. But one thing he did tell me after I brought up the composer Bernard Herrmann, who did the score for Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, was that it would be impossible to not have a bit of Bernard Herrmann within his music. In addition to the music score, Harry Manfredini also created the iconic sound that has become synonymous with the franchise. The sound is used whenever the killer is around, and Manfredini was actually inspired by John Williams' score for Jaws. The same way the music signified the presence of the shark, this sound signified the presence of the killer. In the film's finale, the character Alice, played by Adrienne King, is the only counsellor remaining and the movie's final girl. The killer is then revealed to be not Jason, but his mother, Pamela Voorhees, played by Betsy Palmer, who is absolutely terrific in the role.
Kill her, Mommy. Kill her. Don't let her live. I won't, Jason. I won't.
Some of you may not know this, but Betsy Palmer was a very well-known actress, and she only accepted the role in Friday the 13th because she was desperate to get a new car. When she read the script, she actually thought the movie was a piece of shit. She tells Alice that in 1957, her son Jason drowned in the lake while the camp counselors were too busy doing the hanky-panky instead of watching him, and now she's taking her revenge. After Mrs. Voorhees attempts to murder Alice, she is soon decapitated by our final girl. You may notice in this scene that Mrs. Voorhees' hands look a little bit hairy, and that's because they belong to none other than Tasso. Once you think the nightmare is all over, we get this slow zoom-in shot of Alice sat in a canoe, accompanied by peaceful music, and then still to this day, this is one of my favourite jump scare moments in horror history. It's a very well-known jump scare, but the first time you watch it and see Jason's decomposing corpse coming out of the lake, it's sure to make you shit your pants. It was actually Tom Savini's idea to have Jason pop out at the end, and his idea was inspired by the ending of 1976's Carrie. Upon its release, Friday the 13th was a massive box office success, grossing $60 million worldwide from its $550,000 budget. As a result of the success, Friday the 13th would become one of horror's biggest and most beloved franchises, receiving a total of 9 sequels, a crossover, a remake, video games, and more merchandise than you can count. In fact, the franchise received a new installment for nearly every single year of the 1980s. People just couldn't get enough of these movies and Jason Voorhees. Speaking of Jason, he would be introduced as the primary antagonist from the first sequel onwards, much to the dismay of the original film's writer Victor Miller, who said that Jason should have stayed as a victim, and because of this, he hasn't even seen any of the sequels. On top of this, Jason would not be portrayed with his infamous hockey mask until the 3rd installment. Jason is now one of horror's most iconic characters, up there on horror Mount Rushmore with Michael Myers, Leatherface and Freddy Krueger. Other horror characters are available, and Freddy Krueger is one that we're going to get to very soon. So in conclusion, Friday the 13th remains to this day to be the quintessential example of the 80s slasher movie. It has everything. All of the slasher tropes are there, from the final girl, to the sexed up teens getting killed off, to the top-notch moments of blood and gore, and everything in between. It's very fitting that this film came out in 1980, as it was the perfect introduction to the decade of splatter films. Obviously, Friday the 13th's legacy and influence cannot be overstated, and just like the character of Jason Voorhees, this franchise will seemingly never die. So that concludes today's video. I hope that you all enjoyed this episode on Friday the 13th, and don't forget to join me in tomorrow's video. We'll be taking a look at another film from 1980, and this time it's the work of one of the greatest directors in history, Stanley Kubrick. I'll see you there.